All right. So let me introduce you to our presenters today. They are, of course, amazing. We're so lucky that they partner with us. Susan Richmond is the Executive Director of Neighborhood Cats, having served in that role since 2010. She oversees hands-on TNR programs in New York City and New Jersey City, and on the island of Maui, as well as using her prior Madison Avenue advertising experience to write, among other things, crowdfunding appeals to help the many sick and injured cats who come neighborhood cats' way. One of her favorite projects currently is a veterinary scholarship program designed to train community cat-oriented vets in high volume spay neuter techniques. When she's not in the office, you can find Susie out in the fields of Maui, where she recently passed the 1,000th cat trapped mark, which is amazing. So you've got some expertise. Please take advantage of it. Ask questions in that questions box. And Brian Cordes, who you'll be hearing from, serves as Neighborhood Cat's National Programs Director and Susie Richmond's husband. Back in 1999, while working in Manhattan as both an attorney and a video director, Brian co-founded Neighborhood Cats after TNRing a colony near where he lived. Except for a 6-year stint as a grants manager for PetSmart Charities, Brian has been with the organization ever since. He has authored and co-authored handbooks on grassroots TNR, community TNR, the return to field programs, and you can always find him online where he regularly presents both basic and advanced webinars on all things TNR in partnership with the Community Cats podcast, and we are grateful to have him. And I do hear your microphone is on, so Brian, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Kristen, and thanks everybody for taking time out today to learn about this innovative program. As Kristen mentioned, about halfway through we'll have a break and then we'll be doing cat trivia. Among the handouts are a copy of all the slides that you're going to see today, as well as live links. So you don't need to be taking notes, just make sure you download that, that handout. Another handout is the Neighborhood Cats TNR Handbook. And if you're interested in anything to do with trap, neuter, return, you'll probably find something in there about that. Okay, so I want to point out that today is part of a three-part webinar series that we have with the Community Cats podcast about doing trap, neuter, return on a community level. We also have a series of webinars on the hands-on stuff, drop traps and trapping tips and tricks and caretaking tips and tricks. But this is specifically for people who are interested in it on a program level. And this is the third in the series. The first two were basically grassroots, how to get the public involved in doing TNR. That's from the backyard to the front page. And then we did targeted TNR. And those have both been recorded and are available on the Community Cats podcast website. And today we're doing the third in the series, which is return to field. And anything we talk about today that you want to take a deeper dive in, Neighborhood Cats, in partnership with the Humane Society of the United States and Alley Cat Advocates, which is a TNR organization in Louisville, Kentucky, have authored the Return to Field Handbook, which you can download for free at the link you see on this page, or if you'd like to have a print copy, you can purchase that. And everything we're going to talk about today, again, if you want to take a deeper dive, you'll find it in this handbook. I want to just clarify some terminology before we get started. So you'll often hear me refer to community cats, and what is a community cat? Well, really that's any cat that's free roaming and not owned in the traditional sense of the way that a pet cat is owned. It's important to understand that their socialization level can range from one extreme, which is very friendly, to the other extreme, which is very feral and unsocialized, and then everything in between. So you can be a community cat whether you're a cat that can be picked up and held in someone's lap, or a cat that won't come within 20 feet of someone. These cats are often part of what we refer to as colonies. And a colony is a group of cats, doesn't matter the number, who share a common food source and a common territory. So just so we know what we're talking about when we use these terms. So what is return to field? Just a real short description is, as depicted in this diagram, starting on the upper left, a free-roaming cat is trapped, could be by a private citizen, an animal control officer, or really anyone else, is brought to the local shelter and impounded. If the shelter decides that the cat is eligible for a return to field, the cat is then spayed or neutered, vaccinated and ear tipped. After recovery from surgery, which is typically overnight, he or she is then returned back to the location of the trapping. Now, identification of the feeder or the caretaker is not usually required. And we'll be discussing later at length which cats are eligible for this program. But that's the basic idea: is you have a free roaming cat who's there on Main Street. Typically, private citizen catches the cat, surrenders them at the shelter. The shelter decides the cat is eligible, does a spay or neuter surgery, and then returns the cat right back to where he was trapped. And you can see the only difference is now Kitty is ear tipped. So the question always comes up, what is the difference between return to field, or RTF for short, versus TNR, or trap neuter return? Because they both involve free roaming cats, typically community cats. They both involve the cat being trapped and then spayed or neutered and then returned back to the original location. So the key distinction has to do with the fact that in return to field, the cat is impounded at the local shelter. So the shelter at that point, having intake the cat, gains legal custody and is the entity that determines the outcome. So is this cat going to be put up for adoption? Is he going to be returned back into the field? It's up to the shelter to decide this. So as I mentioned, the typical scenario is a private citizen traps the cat and then surrenders the cat to the shelter, who then makes the decision whether or not to return the cat back to his original territory. In contrast with trap neuter return, the cat is not impounded at the local shelter, so the shelter does not take legal custody and is not the one that decides what's going to happen. Your typical scenario is that a caretaker or somebody assisting the caretaker traps the cat and brings the cat to a spay-neuter clinic. After the cat is fixed, the caretaker returns the cat back to the original territory. So the point is that return to field is a shelter-based program, that it's the shelter who's making the decisions about what's going to happen. That's the big difference. So where did return to field originate? It's kind of an interesting story. So back in 2008 in Jacksonville, and you can see Jacksonville highlighted with that red arrow on the upper right of your slide. First Coast No More Homeless Pets, which is a high volume spay neuter clinic based in Jacksonville. The president at that time, Rick Descharme, he actually attended a workshop that I was giving, and I suggested that in order to start to begin cooperating with the local open admission shelter, that a good first step is to ask them to let you know when ear-tipped cats have come in, so that you can then try to return them back to their colonies. So he met with the head of the Animal Care and Protective Services and made that request. Well, much to his surprise, the director, who at the time was an interim director and an engineer by trade, not somebody with animal welfare background, he came back and he said, not only will I give you the ear-tipped cats, I'll give you all the cats, all the community cats that come in. And then you can return them after any that are not ear-tipped are spayed and neutered. And Rick, being Rick, was up for the challenge, and he found funding, a lot of it from Best Friends Animal Society. And in about August of 2008, they began this program where any community cats that came into the shelter were transferred over to the spay neuter clinic, who then fixed them and transported them back to their original locations and released them. So here are the results of that program, the first several years of it. The blue is intake, and the red is euthanasia. The green bar are the number of RTF cats. So you can see that in 2007, almost close to 14,000, between 13,000 and 14,000 cats came into the Jacksonville Animal Care and Protective Services shelter. Of those, about 13,000, over 11,000 of them were euthanized. So that's staggering numbers, and not particularly good ones. Now in 2008, like I say, in August, the Return to Field program began, and you can see how euthanasia started to drop, and it dropped by approximately the number of cats who were returned to field, which makes perfect sense, right? These are cats that otherwise would have been euthanized at that time. So instead, they got a live release. The next year, even more dramatic, more RTF cats and more dramatic drops in euthanasia. And that continued on up until the time that I have figures for, you get to 2014, and you have maybe approximately 500 cats were euthanized. So because of this program, the number of cats being euthanized went from over 11,000 to about 500 a year. Also, you can see how intake dropped as well. It's a little bit speculative about why that happened. My theory is that the shelter, by practicing spay, neuter, and return of community cats, made that the model for how the community as a whole should deal with these cats. And the volume of TNR that was happening in the community independent of the shelter also went up quite a bit during that period of time. And more cats being spay neutered, again, I'm theorizing, may have resulted in fewer kittens and just fewer cats to be brought to the shelter in the first place. But anyway, the key driver in return to field programs is the red bar, which is euthanasia, and you can see what a dramatic effect this had. So what are the benefits? When we step back and we look at return to field programs, which since Jacksonville have become more and more the norm for shelters. We don't have exact numbers on how many shelters are doing return to field now, but it's a lot. I don't know if it's a majority yet, but it's becoming more and more the way to go. So obviously you have lower euthanasia, since most of the vast majority of these cats that are being returned to field would not have a live outcome otherwise. So this frees up a lot of resources for the shelter. Instead of spending money killing cats, they can spend money on spay neuter or whatever they want, dog behavior programs, whatever it is. It frees up resources. The shelter itself becomes a healthier environment for the animals because they're not as crowded. Also, public support. So fair or unfair, the public tends to support animal shelters that have live outcomes as the vast majority of their animals, and they tend to stay away from shelters where there's high kill rates. So as live release rates rise, so does fundraising. More people come to the shelter, more adoptions happen. There's also culture change inside and outside the shelter. I mentioned how in Jacksonville, the shelter became a leader in teaching the community what's the proper way to deal with community cats. And it's not to just drop them off and have them disappear, but it's to spay and neuter them. And that starts to have an influence on cats that never touch the shelter. But also inside the shelter, there can be just remarkable transformations. Um, I'll give you an example in Albuquerque, where euthanasia was the predominant outcome for most community cats once they were impounded. When they started doing a return to field program, the lead veterinary technician, who for years had been the one to administer the euthanasia drugs, she asked if she could come and observe one of the very first releases of a feral cat that was done. And so of course they said yes, and she came along. And when they let the cat out of the trap, and he or she went running off, the tech burst into tears, and she was just so happy to see this change happening. So it can be a huge, huge morale booster. People don't get into animal work generally because they like to see animals dying. Um, there's a lot of research that shows that staff in high kill shelters, where a lot of healthy animals are being put down, suffer from much higher than normal issues with mental health. So suicide rates, drug addiction, post-traumatic stress, a lot of turnover. And once the predominant outcome is life instead of death, that starts to change. Also, with a return to field program, we don't like to talk about this too much, but high kill shelters um, are probably, with community cats. A lot of those community cats are probably someone's pet who was roaming, and now they don't have any identification, and the owner's not coming to the shelter looking for the pet in time, if at all, and they end up being euthanized. So if you're returning cats back to where they were, you're not going to be doing that. So why stop euthanizing? And because that's usually what happens when there's a high volume of community cats entering a shelter and there is not a return to field program. Well, historically, shelters with very high euthanasia rates, if you look at their data over time, you usually don't see any improvement in intake and euthanasia rates. They either level off or they may rise. Complaint calls don't go down. Whatever amount of predation on wildlife may be happening in the community doesn't go down. And the number of community cats out on the landscape doesn't seem to go down either, because they just keep coming in the same or rising numbers. There's also a lot of costs. I mentioned the high stress and the high turnover and the poor public relations, and also lower adoptions. And again, this is all borne out by quite a bit of historical data. So it's important to understand, if you're trying to wrap your head around why is it better to let the cat go, um, it's important to understand why lethal control fails. Why, after decades of euthanizing community cats, do we still have a cat overpopulation problem? So these are there's many reasons, but here's some of the most important ones. So at least at this stage, in communities that are suffering from cat overpopulation, there's usually way too many cats and too few animal control resources to begin getting a handle on it. And for those of you who've done trapping, who encountered a colony of 15 or 20 cats, you know how much work it is to get all of them and get them spayed and neutered and taken care of and then put them back out. And animal control officers have a lot of other responsibilities too, and they don't have that kind of time. So they don't trap in the way that somebody, a caretaker doing TNR would do. Typically they won't know how many cats there are in the first place at a location. The feeder may be hostile. They'll put out 5 traps, and whoever they catch, they round up at the end of the day and they bring them back. And it's job done until the next complaint comes in. So it's not a very efficient or effective way of, from a population control point of view, of accomplishing much of anything. I mentioned caretaker resistance. People who feed the cats and care for them are typically very bonded to the cats, and they're not okay with them being taken away usually. There's the vacuum effect, which I'll discuss more in a moment. And then there's the failure to capture all the members in a colony. So if you capture just a few of them and the rest of them remain and they're intact, well, they're just going to continue to reproduce. And from a population point of view, you'll have accomplished nothing. But I'm sure a lot of you have heard this term, vacuum effect. And sometimes terminology becomes so prevalent that we don't really understand what's behind the term. We just say, oh, vacuum effect without really knowing how it works. So let me give you a very quick example. So this is a colony of cats, say 10 cats at this grocery store, and they're eating out of the dumpster, and the garbage can, I'm sorry, was the best I could find as a icon for a dumpster. So there's enough food put out by the grocery store every day to feed 10 cats. And that's why there's 10 cats and not 20 or 30. So sometimes you hear people say like, oh, if you don't fix those 10 cats, in 3 years, there's going to be, 720,000 of them. That's not what happens. There's a thing called the carrying capacity of an environment, and that's how many cats can that location support. And that has to do with, well, how much food is available and what kind of shelter is available. And when we're talking about a dumpster at a grocery store, there's only enough food there for 10 cats. So once the population gets above 10, nature takes over and some of the cats will migrate to find new food sources. Disease will set in. Tomcats may kill kittens. Whatever it may be, nature will make sure that the number of cats there pretty much approximates the amount of food that is available. So you have 10 cats and somebody decides, all right, we're going to take them away. We're going to euthanize them. They're all feral. They're unadoptable. So we're left with this situation in the immediate aftermath of the trapping. So what's the problem, right? Problem solved. No more cats. All taken care of. We don't need RTF. What do you guys think? Put it in the question box if you think you know what is the problem. Why isn't this working? Any guesses? Oh, I see you're all pondering. There is still a food source. Lindsay just nailed it. There is still, and 10 more cats will come. Okay, you guys do know. Yeah, there's still a food source, right? This is the vacuum. There's no cats, but there's enough food for 10 cats, right? And is this grocery store off by an island by itself where there's nothing else and no one else lives there? Well, of course not. The grocery store is in the middle of neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods have their own colonies of community cats, and they're not altered. So they're reaching their carrying capacity, and eventually they're going to be looking for new food sources. And lo and behold, there's the grocery store with its dumpster that nobody's taking advantage of in the cat world. So it's not usually very long. In fact, it can happen very quickly that a couple of cats show up, Adam and Eve, and they look around and they say, plenty of food, no competition, let's hang out, let's stay here and raise a family. And in 1 or 2 breeding cycles, you're right back up to 10 cats. And this is the vacuum effect and why trying to eradicate cat populations has been a historical failure. And the only success, if you want to call it success, the only times cats have been successfully eradicated on a large scale has been on remote islands with intensive amount of work and intensive amount of resources over the course of many, many years. So in a urban, crowded, resource challenged environment, it's just not a successful strategy. So we're going to return the cats instead, right? We're going to fix them, we're going to put them back. And the first question people ask, or the first fear that they have, is everybody's going to freak out, right? All of a sudden, the people who've been dropping cats off at your shelter and thinking job's done, now you're telling them, nope, kitty's coming right back to your backyard. Uh, they're all going to get really angry and upset and all that, right? So it's a reasonable fear for you to have that the community um, may act, may be up in arms. And um, it's important to test this, to look at the data, to look at the research, and not assume that that's the reaction that's going to happen. So let's do that. So this was a survey that was commissioned by Alley Cat Allies in 2007, and although these surveys were commissioned by animal welfare groups, they were conducted by professional polling organizations in order, so there's not any bias in the data. So it's not Alley Cat Allies that asked the questions. They just hired, like, I think it was Harris Polling or something, one of these professional organizations to do these. And in this particular case, the question, as you can see, was, if you saw a stray cat in your community and you had to choose between either leaving the cat where the cat is or catching the cat and having the cat euthanized, what do you consider to be more humane, right? And here's the results. So 81% said uh, leave the cat alone, and only 14% preferred that the cat be put down. So that's really eye-opening, right? That most of the public, 4/5 in this case, prefers a live outcome and would rather the cat, just stay in the environment. Now, a little bit later on in 2014, Best Friends Animal Society did another a variation off of this and added a third option, which was, you know, um, leave the cat where they are, have the cat um, impounded with and being specific that the cat would be euthanized, or the third option was A here, which is basically TNR. Sterilize the cat and have the cat returned. So they had three options to choose from now, and here's the results. And you can see that again, the vast majority preferred a live outcome. So you've got 68% who preferred TNR and 8% who said, well, do nothing, just leave them where they are. So that's 3/4 of the respondents, kind of adding up to 76%, which is very similar to that 81% we saw in the Alley Cat Allies survey, who wanted a live outcome. And it's the minority who wanted the cats to be rounded up and, if necessary, euthanized if there was no other options. This is a survey that was done in 2008 of Ohio adults, and it just has some interesting data about how prevalent cat feeding is in our country in the United States. So 43% of participants had seen, so almost half of the adults that were surveyed had seen free roaming cats in their neighborhoods on a regular basis, either daily or weekly. 26% had fed a free roaming cat during the prior year. So that's 1 out of 4 participants, 1 out of 4 Ohio adults had put out food for a free roaming cat within the past year. So that's a lot of feeding that's going on. Interestingly, of the people who were feeding free roaming cats, only 1/4 of them had ever brought a cat to the veterinarian. So that's where the challenge lies. You've got 26% of respondents feeding, but then only maybe 6 or 7% who were taking the next step and making sure the cats were not reproducing or were getting proper medical care. But the point being that there's an awful lot of us out there who are feeding cats. The conclusion I think you can draw from this data is that return to field, where you're doing spay neuter and then you're returning the cat into the environment, that's the outcome and the program that's aligned with the majority, the silent majority, who favor live outcomes, and they're okay with community cats. Euthanasia is aligned with the what turns out to be the minority of the public who complain about the cats and just want them removed. And it's important to, if you're working in a shelter or you're involved in animal control in some manner, this may seem very not instinctive at all to you, because that's not what you're hearing, right? When you're fielding calls at the call center, you're not getting people calling up and saying, you know, I think it's great that there are these cats in my backyard and wandering the neighborhood, and I just want to call you up and thank you for leaving them alone and letting them be. And by the way, can you fix them? Um, you're not getting those calls. The calls you're getting are, my backyard smells. I can't sleep. We don't want these cats around. I can't use, I don't like the poop in my backyard. But you're getting all the complaints. And so if you're just going by what your direct experience is at the shelter, you're going to think most of the community hates the cats, right? And that they're going to freak out if you start putting them back. And that's not actually the reality. So, what are some of the common fears that people in our field, animal welfare, tend to have when they're contemplating doing a RTF program? So, one fear is that uh, people are going to hurt the cats, right? Like, a lot of people are surrendering these cats at the shelter because they don't want them, right? They don't want them around. They may not like cats for whatever reason. Um, and one of the things you'll find if you do one of these programs is there's a variety of reasons. And for sure, some people are surrendering the cats because they don't want them and they don't like them. You'll find a lot of people are surrendering the cats because they do like them and they want to help them and they don't know how best to go about doing that. So there's a whole variety of motivations. But the concern is that if somebody who dislikes the cats brings them in and then sees the cat back, they're going to feel like their only alternative is to harm the cats. And there is no data to support that as being true. There's no data that shows a correlation between return to field and increased cruelty. That's really important to understand. There, to the extent there's been research on this, it's been kind of anecdotal, so it's hard to say that, to rule it out and say, no, it doesn't happen. It's just never been shown. In the Jacksonville program, they microchipped the first 6,000 cats in order to see if they could find any kind of correlation between finding more of these cats dead on the road or involved in abuse situations, and they didn't find anything. And they stopped using microchips, which at the time were more expensive than they are today, so they could put the resources into more spay neuter. So they didn't find any noticeable increase in animal abuse cases. Um, I know the shelter that Susie and I worked with on a return to field program here in Maui, the Maui Humane Society, after a couple of years, they didn't see anything in their data either to suggest that there was more reports of cruelty or cases that they were finding or anything like that. So it's important to know there's no data to support that fear. Okay, so how about the fear that people are going to complain? They're going to call up the city councilman or the mayor and they're going to start bad mouthing you. Some of them will. I mean, that's just reality. You're changing the paradigm for years and years. Anybody who didn't like a cat in the backyard All they had to do was trap the cat, drop them off, taken care of. Didn't much matter to them whether a new cat showed up in 3 months, because then they would just trap that cat and bring him to the shelter too. And when you think about it, who's bearing the costs of all this besides the animals with their lives? But the financial costs, they're all being borne by the shelter, right? Once the person buys a trap or borrows a trap, that's it as far as their investment goes, or maybe the gas it takes to drive over to the shelter. But in terms of housing the cat, um, uh, euthanizing, disposing of the body, all of these things are costs that are borne by the shelter. So now all of a sudden you're taking this away, and you're not the community's dumping ground for cats. And the people who like that aren't going to be happy about it, and they're going to complain. And um, the way you best deal with that, in my opinion, is when you're starting your program, go to your local officials. Don't ask them for permission necessarily unless you have to, but just inform them. Just say, hey, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. We've been euthanizing cats for years. We have the same amount of cats coming into the shelter every year. It's not working. It's costing us a ton. And we're going to switch to return to field, and this is why. And be prepared that some people aren't going to like it, and they're going to call you up and complain, and you've basically inoculated them. Now, hopefully they agree with you, but if they don't, it's not going to be a shock when all of a sudden somebody calls up and starts complaining about the shelter and the program that they're doing. And you'll avoid that frantic phone call from your local councilman, like, what are you doing? So anticipate this could happen, and but also be aware, and again, there'll be the majority of people are going to like this, and they may not be calling up and writing letters saying what a great program it is. But again, we go back to our research and we see that most of the public prefers live outcomes. Now, one thing I would add too is um, talk to your rescuers. Okay, that's a big mistake I've seen a lot of shelters make, which is they don't communicate with the local rescue community. And that could be smaller or larger, right, depending on your service area. You may have some very substantial groups, or you may have a collection of individuals or some mixture of the two. They also may not be comfortable, with the idea of cats going back outside for whatever philosophical reasons they have. So it's important to bring them into the conversation and explain what you're doing and why you're doing it, or you're going to risk them misunderstanding what you're doing and raising hell about it when you're further down the road. And then you start to have battle lines and divisions within the animal welfare community, and that's never a good thing. So not going to convince everybody. Everybody's not going to agree with you, but do take the time to make sure everybody understands, whether they agree or not, what you're doing and why. So there's also a fear that, um, with return to field programs, as I'll explain later, you want to turn the cats around as quickly as possible. You want to get them in and out of the shelter, um, preferably within 24 to 48 hours if you can manage that. So the fear is, well, then somebody who loses their pet isn't going to get a chance to reclaim. The cat will be in and out of the shelter before they even know that Fluffy's missing, right? Well, that's true, but the fact is that I'm not sure if it's still exactly 2%, but the national reclaim average for cats is extremely low. It's definitely under 10%, and the last time I checked, it was only 2%. If the cat is returned to their territory, so maybe they were wandering around and the neighbor who doesn't like cats trapped them and brought them in, and there's no microchip or collar or anything like that. Well, if the shelter arranges for the cat to be returned close to where the cat was trapped, well, Fluffy's going to find his own way home. And the chance of that happening versus the owner coming to the shelter and looking for the cat it's much higher with return to field. So you're going to get much more reunifications and lost cats going home, or they're not really lost, displaced, than you will without a return to field program. So, we have a few minutes. Um, Kristen, we could take a few questions right now about kind of just the policy side of this, maybe, like five minutes or so.
Okay. There is a great question here on policy. I'm going to read it verbatim because it's probably going to be easier to get the details in there. Um, RTF is not an option in my area, which is Raleigh, North Carolina. All of the shelters and all the rescues are full, and the municipal shelter is euthanizing for the first time in 8 years. The shelters and rescues, I guess, are declining the help, and they won't put people on a waiting list. And of course, people who are for RTF are very frustrated. The city doesn't recognize community cats. If you feed the cats, you own them, and you're required to keep them on a leash or in a carrier, so they can go after people who are just feeding. Um, Raleigh doesn't illegally allow for TNR or RTF of cats within the city limits. So put on your lawyer cap and let's discuss this.
Well, you've got a whole new topic,
Mhm,
and we did a presentation at this year's, right, 2024's online cat conference hosted
mhm.
by the Community Cats podcast, and I did a full presentation on how to persuade municipal officials to go with trap neuter return, and so I would highly recommend. I believe those recordings are available. They're for sale, I believe.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I would, and we'll be doing it for free, but I don't believe that's scheduled until next year, 2025. So, um,
No.
and if you need help in terms of the finances, contact us at Neighborhood Cats. We have some scholarships available. But so step number one would be watch that presentation, okay? Because
Okay.
I go step by step over how do you make the case, what kind of data do you use? Who do you talk to, and various strategies, because what you're talking about is you can't you're not at a place in that community where you can talk about return to field programs because there's no building blocks, there's no
Yeah.
foundation for it. So the very first step, it's like we tell people when they're doing a trap neuter return project just in their neighborhood, the first step isn't to trap. The first step is to talk to the community, is to build support, to get people to understand what you're doing. And you
Mhm.
have to think about doing that on a larger scale, on a municipal scale. And advocacy is really the first step of any kind of trap neuter return or community cat program that you're going to have there. So I can't really quickly teach you how to be an effective advocate, but I can in about 50 minutes. So, so
We
go
are
ahead, watch that webinar. And if you can't afford the fee, then write to us at info@neighborhoodcats.org or communitycatspodcast.com, and we'll make sure you
cool.
get a chance to see it.
Absolutely. Yeah, advocacy is really tough. It's easy to get frustrated quickly. If you were to give somebody one piece of advice to start their advocacy, um, outside of watching the video, what would you say would be the first thing they got to do?
I think the key to success in being a what I would call a TNR advocate
Mhm,
is really understanding that nothing else works. There's no other method available if you want to control the cat population besides sterilization. That's the only chance you have at success. So as an advocate, you need to understand really well why that is. Understand the concept of carrying capacity, understand why all the challenges to using euthanasia as a matter of cat control. And then once you really understand it, you want to go back and you want to get the data that supports that. So you need how's intake in the Raleigh community? What's the trend over the last 10 years? Has it ever gone down, or does it keep going up or staying the same, which would indicate there's no effect of what they're doing on the cat population? How about the number of complaints? You need to demonstrate that what's been going on and has been ineffective and all the money being spent on it is waste.
mhm,
And then explain why this method has at least a chance of success, and there are plenty of documented cases of it having succeeded. And then if you can't get the whole enchilada at once, then you propose a pilot project
Mhm.
that you carefully select and ensure that it's a success. And then you demonstrate to the frightened community that this isn't a horrible thing, and that people like it and it's successful, and you build from there. That's it in a
Yeah.
nutshell.
Yep. Little bites rather than trying to choke down the whole thing is a real good piece of advice to start that.
Yep.
I think also maybe understanding what's going to sway the opinions of the people you're trying to convince, like the city councilors probably don't
I,
care
I,
about the
would-
cats.
I always I always read their bios and look for the
Yep,
ones that have cats and look
yep,
at them when you're at the hearing.
yes, yes, and also talk about the money because they are really interested
Yeah.
in what's going to save them money. So,
Well,
um,
there are advantages to trap, neuter, return, and basically uh, one of the things I would recommend as an advocate is don't say TNR that much. I mean, I
yeah,
do it among ourselves, but you should be talking about spay, neuter, talk about sterilization. Um, that those are words that are going to be more easily understood.
mhm,
And yeah, what what all the benefits are, and um, understand that municipal officials have more concerns than the number of cats. They're more
yes,
concerned about the people. That's their job. So they're concerned about public health. They're concerned about nuisance complaints. So if you can demonstrate, and the literature is out there, that you can lower the number of cats and thereby reduce the number of complaints, or just spay neuter itself will reduce the
mhm,
number of complaints, and they're going to get less calls. That that's what they care about. I found that municipal officials care more about complaints than they
true.
do about intake to the shelter or numbers or things like that. They care about intake to the shelter if they're paying for it.
Mhm,
If each cat coming in costs them, then they want there to be fewer. So yeah, and again, we go over all of that in that presentation.
yeah, we're very excited that you're going to be doing that presentation too next year as part of the regular series. So that's super exciting. Um,
Yeah, all right, thank you so much, Kristen. I thought we'd just start off with something a little more fun, but also kind of the point of the Return to Field program. We don't want to lose track of why we're doing this. This is just a short, fun little video, a compilation of some of the releases that Susie and I did when we helped launch the Return to Field program here in Maui.
Here, buddy. You're home. You excited? Here you go. Hey, kitty, you're home. Gotta go.
Okay, so there you go. Yeah, there's nothing quite like seeing a cat happy to be home again. All right, so moving on with our presentation, we're going to talk about the mechanics of doing this. And in terms of the flow, this is the way we recommend it goes. So you have intake, and that's your opportunity to gather as much information about the cat and the cat's circumstances as you can. You also want to be talking about potentially, you might decide not to, but you might want to talk about return to field with the finders. And that's the term that's used for the people who bring the cat to the shelter. They're typically called finders. Then once you have the cat within the shelter, you're assessing eligibility, whether they're suitable for the return to field program. If they are, you need to house them, you have the surgery, and then of course you have the return, and then you may have actions you want to take post-return. So we're going to go through each of these steps. So intake is really a crucial point. And if you get the return to field handbook, and again, you can download a copy for free, and anybody who came in late, the slide is at the beginning of the presentation with a link, and it's in, the slides are in your handouts. There are forms that you have people at admissions follow, lists of questions that they ask that can be done very quickly, can be done just in a couple of minutes, but it gets you a lot of really crucial information. And of course, where the cat was trapped, what we call the location of origin, is really critical. And there's some common mistakes. It's where the cat was trapped may not be exactly what the finder's home address was. So you want to clarify that. If you're having trouble pinpointing where the cat was trapped, you can always ring up Google Maps and work with the finder to identify as close as you can the exact location. Also, you want to find out as much as you can about the cat's history. Were they a recent arrival in the neighborhood? Have they been there for a long time? Did they bring the cat in because he was sick, or what was the cat's behavior? So, for example, why that's really important. So sometimes, like let's say the cat ends up being friendly, and you don't know whether to, you're trying to make a decision about whether to return him back or not. Well, having a little bit of the history of the cat's behavior can be the pivotal factor. So we've had cases where people have reported a cat came onto their porch that they'd never seen before. They put out a little bit of food, and then the cat never left for a week, did not leave the porch, or did not move from under a car, or whatever it is. So that's a cat whose behavior is showing they're not very familiar with the territory, and they've found what they feel is a safe place, possibly with a little bit of food, and they're not going to leave unless they're forced to. So that would point more towards a cat that had been abandoned, as opposed to a cat who popped up on the porch, had a bite to eat, and then went on his way, who had been seen in the neighborhood months before that. That would be, you'd probably be a lot more comfortable about putting that cat back in the territory. So the more you can find out about history, the better. Are there other cats in the area? What are the cat circumstances? Is there a known feeder? Is there construction nearby? What is the finder's reason for bringing the cat in? Again, that's where I was saying you'll find a whole host of motivations. Sometimes it's because they keep having kittens and they don't know what to do anymore. And when you talk about spay neuter, that may solve the problem. Sometimes they just don't like cats. Sometimes they don't want the cat in their yard, and you have an opportunity to talk about deterrence. So important to ask that. Also make a note of what's the finder's attitude. Are they hostile, indifferent, friendly? Because that may inform whether you do the return, and if you do, how you do it. So get that return to field handbook and look at the sample forms in the back for intake, and then adapt them for your purposes rather than start from scratch would be my recommendation. So when you're talking return to field with finders, well, the first decision is, well, are you going to talk about it or not? I know in Jacksonville, that very first RTF program, they started off talking to finders about the idea of bringing the cats back to, where they were trapped. Pardon me for a moment. And in general, it didn't go well. They ended up having a lot of arguments with people, and they ultimately decided we're just gonna do it. We're not gonna try to talk about it. We don't, the cat's being surrendered to us. We'll determine the outcome. And instead, what they did is they kind of slipped it into their surrender form as one of the possibilities of what might happen once the cat was surrendered. So that's one way to go. I think that in many communities, so this was back in 2008, and now here we are 16 years later, there's a lot more tolerance and understanding of these programs. Not everywhere and not everyone, but more. And if you don't talk to your finders about the possibility of the cat coming back, you may be missing opportunities. So like I said, somebody may really love the cat, but they can't handle any more kittens, and they don't know that there are spay neuter services available. And once they do, they may come and pick up the cat themselves and save you the trouble of having to return the cat yourself. So there's a lot of, and again, you can identify problems. You may be able to mitigate their complaints with deterrence, like a lot of return to field programs keep a stock of motion activated sprinklers, for example, because those are good ways to keep cats out of yards, and they'll lend them to people. And usually after a month or two, the cats learn not to step into the yard. So that conversation can be very, very fruitful, but it's a shelter by shelter decision, and you can always try one thing, and then if it doesn't work, try another. So who's going to decide whether the cat's eligible? You can, some shelters do it at admissions. So the person doing intake is the one that gathers the information and then decides on the future pathway for the cat. We found that a better way to do it is for admissions to gather the information, but then for somebody who's experienced and knows more about community cats, for example, a community cat coordinator, if there's one on staff, it's much better for them to at least review the information and any decisions that might have been made, because sometimes somebody with experience is going to just pick up on things that somebody in admissions who may be brand new to the animal welfare world might miss. So, but you could do one of the two. You could take a team approach where you get input from various departments, veterinary, intake, community cat, but that can be very time demanding in terms of if you're in a high volume intake municipal shelter, you're probably not going to be able to take the time to have team meetings over every cat. I think it's great if you can. Again, the more minds go into it, and the more that things that are considered, the better. But probably most shelters are going to go with like either admissions or the equivalent of the community cat coordinator making that call. So then we get into eligibility itself. And there's a number of things to consider. The first thing I want to emphasize, though, is that all this should be considered holistically. And one factor may be weak, but another factor strong. And you have to look at the overall picture in order to make the best decision. So when you're looking at the cat herself, obviously the first thing is there any indicia of ownership? Because if there's a microchip or a collar or something like that, that's going to change the equation, and probably that cat's going to need to be held and an opportunity, an effort made to locate the original owner. If that turns out not to be fruitful, then the cat can come back and be considered again for return to field. Now, the health of the cat is a tricky one, because in your ideal return to field candidate is coming in good, excellent body condition, good weight, bright eyes, um, no obvious signs of illness of any kind. And that tells you that, hey, that cat was doing fine wherever they were. So sometimes people say like, hey, I live in Minnesota and it's the middle of the winter, and how could I return a cat in these conditions back outside? And my question is always, well, how was the cat doing when the cat came in? And if they're perfectly fine, and you can reliably say they came from an outdoor setting, well, they figured it out. They'll be fine. Um, Now, on the other hand, if the cat comes in and the cat's underweight and the coat is dull and the eyes are drippy, that's not a good candidate for return to field. That's not a cat that was thriving outdoors. And the risks to the cat, if you return them, are I'm not saying rule it out, but the risks are higher, obviously. Now, you can't universally say, okay, unhealthy cats don't go back and healthy cats do, because sometimes the health issues are such that once they're overcome, the cat will do fine. So if a cat comes in and they have an abscess on their paw, and that's the reason they can't go back right away, well, maybe once the abscess has been, but they're otherwise fine, right? Good body condition and all that. Well, once the wound is treated, then they may be a very good return to field candidate. So are they healthy? And if they're not, why? Has a lot to do with it. Disability, is the cat have 3 legs? Are they missing an eye? Something like that. Again, it's very few of these things are black or white, like where you should say, all right, we're never going to release a declawed cat, or we're never going to release a cat with 3 legs, because it all depends on their circumstances, right? If they have somebody is been identified as taking care of them, and they're coming from a relatively, a cul-de-sac, and they don't move around much, and they're fairly safe, then potentially you could put them back despite the disability. So I'm not saying you should, but I'm just saying it's not, automatic. Nothing should be automatic. Age, that goes more towards kittens. And it, if you do this work, you know that you start getting beyond 8 weeks old, and the kittens start becoming more and more difficult to socialize. And if you're in a lot of communities, the resources available to socialize feral kittens are not very many, and probably taken up already. So you may have like an 8 or 9, 9-week-old kitten who's feral, and no other alternative. And so it's probably not a good idea, again, to have some bright red line where you say, well, if they're under 4 months, they're not going back out. Then what are you going to do with that 9-week-old feral kitten who might have done perfectly fine if he had gone back into his territory? On the other hand, I do want to say with age, you have to consider what it may look like to the public, and be careful about that. So I've seen programs get into trouble where the van pulls up, hand reaches out, drops a 6-week-old kitten on the sidewalk and drives away, and leaves the kitten there crying. Somebody comes along, takes a video of it, and boom, your program is in trouble. So don't do that. If they're little baby kittens who are just going to, they have to be released very close to where they were trapped, like almost the exact same spot. And if you don't know that, or you can't do that, be careful about protecting your program. And that's where you do make the effort to, and at 6 weeks, they should be able to be socialized. So again, we talked about the history, what was their behavior at the time they were found, and of course their temperament. If the cat is really feral, or acting very feral, or doing poorly in a shelter situation, if you can take some time, just about every cat, whether they're friendly or not, has the potential to act feral upon being trapped, because they're freaked out, right? And they're in a strange environment, and it may take them at least a few days before they'll calm down and show their true nature. But there are also cats who are friendly and just hate being in a shelter environment and will never act adoptable when they're in that setting. So if you're not sure and you have capacity to take cats in, and you think that might be a good outcome, but you're not sure if the cat's feral or not, then you might want to wait a bit. Um, but if you're pretty sure, if you don't have that luxury and the cat is acting feral and is not a suitable adoption or foster candidate, then yeah, return to field is a great alternative. So temperament's a factor, but it can be a deceptive one, and sometimes we'll talk about friendly cats. It really doesn't matter whether they're friendly or not if other things are pointing towards returning the cat. So how about the location of origin? This is information you'll have gathered at intake. Are they about to knock all the buildings on the block down? Is there a history of somebody shooting cats at that location? Most likely the answer is no, but you want to know about that. Does the finder, the person who surrenders the cat, or other residents pose a realistic risk of harm? And I emphasize the word realistic because a lot of people, a lot of finders, not all of them, well, I should even say a lot, some, they'll be angry when they find out the cat may be coming back, and they may act threatening or say threatening things. And that's in most shelters experience, that's not, that's just bluster. Somebody who's really going to cause harm is not going to be talking about it. But on the other hand, if there's a history of problems with that particular person, or they start, potentially you're afraid they're going to get violent at the intake desk, yeah, you might want to consider that. But it's not very many people out there who are going to actually commit acts of cruelty towards animals. So don't be too much on a knife's edge about that, but do assess if there's a history of harm and things like that. Are there caretakers or others who are waiting for the cat? Are there feeders who want the cat back? Is there any vulnerable protected wildlife in the area? So some ground nesting birds who are rare, that maybe not a great place to be. That may be where you try to find a barn placement or something like that, but that would be pretty rare. So what about friendly cats and kittens? That's really the most controversial part of this program now. I mean, the program as a whole was certainly controversial when it started, and still is in areas where it's being introduced. But among more mature return to field programs, the issue of what to do with friendly cats and kittens is sort of the hot button topic now. And our feeling at Neighborhood Cats is that there's not a clear right or wrong about this. The only thing we think is wrong is if the program is running on autopilot, and there are things like policies like they came from outside, so they go back outside, right? Well, they may have been found outside, but that doesn't mean they came from outside. Somebody might have dumped them. They may have gotten lost, whatever it might be. Or something like, well, all cats over 4 months old go back, and none of the cats under do. So this bright red line about age. And as I discussed before, that could be a mistake when it comes to that individual cat. So what you're after is an evaluation to the extent you can, and you may only have a few minutes to do this, but still don't go on autopilot. Try to give each cat an individual assessment and to the best of your ability, determine what the best available outcome is. And you're not always going to be right, but at least you won't be making, it's more comfortable to be on autopilot. Then you don't have to think about it. Then you don't have to worry about, did I make the right decision or not? It's like, well, the cat's this old, so this happens. The cat came from outside. They go, very easy, but it's not necessarily the best thing for the animals. So when you're evaluating what to do with social friendly cats and kittens, say, who can be very easily handled. One of the things you want to consider is what is the shelter's capacity for care? So if the shelter is full, it doesn't really matter how friendly the cat is, right? There's no room for them. It's not going to be a healthy environment. And keeping the cat out of the shelter is priority number one. And if he's got a home, he's going to find it a lot faster on his own than for you to go find a foster or to try to find him a home. So in that idea, what is the average length of stay? If the cat's going to, potentially be in the shelter for weeks or months and it's crowded, that's not a good thing. And that may weigh in favor of putting the cat back. What's the cat's history? I mentioned that before. We had a cat, a very friendly cat who was brought in, and the rest of the neighbors were up in arms. This had been a cat who'd been part of the community, an outdoor cat, for years, and they wanted their cat back. So certainly that was an easy decision to make. So in the end, when it comes to eligibility, um, each cat deserves his own evaluation and consideration of the unique circumstances to the extent that you're able to gather that information. So once you've decided the cat is eligible, where you're going to house them, we recommend you keep the RTF cats separate from the general cat population and if it's possible, to keep them away from barking dogs, and do that as well. What you're seeing in the slide here is what we call the TNR VIA at the Maui Humane Society, and this is a room that's used to be an overnight drop-off kennel and got converted to a much better use. And this is the community cat room, and you can see how the cats are kept in traps, not in cages. So they're only going to be there for a short, couple of days, so they're perfectly fine in the traps. And you can see how the traps are up on tables. That makes it easier to feed and to clean. And it's quiet and it's separate. So any space that's what we call warm, dry, and secure. Warm so that when they come out of spay-neuter surgery and maybe not be able to fully regulate their body temperature, it's at least 65 degrees in the environment, protected from the weather. And people who are not involved with the program do not have, or animals who are not in part of the program do not have access to the space. When you're thinking about where to house them, if you have choices, try to make it convenient in terms of them coming in and then going off to be fixed. So if there's an on-campus clinic, you don't want to keep the cats in a room where you have to then walk across campus and climb 3 flights of stairs to get to the clinic. You want something much closer. And same thing with pickup drop-off. If you're using an outside clinic, think about the ease of that if you have choices. In terms of the equipment, I mentioned that traps on tables. Some shelters prefer to use feral cat dens inside cages, which, if that equipment is available to you, is perfectly fine. If you don't know what a feral cat den is, it's that white box-looking thing that the cat is inside of, and you can see how there's a porthole door to the right of that's lifted up. So you can put the den inside the cage with the porthole door shut so the cat can't get out. And then when the den is inside the cage, you can use a ruler or a broomstick and you can lift the porthole door up through the bars of the cages. So there's never any chance of injury or escape. That's a much more extensive and expensive setup, but that is what some shelters prefer. Either way is going to be fine. Certainly if the cat's going to be there for an extended stay, then probably better off in a for more than several days, then you might want to use cages if they're available to you. Although we have held cats in traps. I mean, we don't like to do it for more than, say, 4 or 5 days, but sometimes we've had to medicate a cat for like a week or two, and they get bored, but they're fine. It doesn't pose a threat to their health to be in a trap, as long as it's covered and it's quiet. So one of the considerations, of course, then is the length of the stray hold. If you're in a jurisdiction with a 10-day stray hold, well, that's going to put a cramp in your return to field program, and you're going to need this more extensive housing to hold the cats. But I do want to, if you are, facing that, Arizona came up with a great workaround, which is they passed a law. They passed a state law that if the cat is part of a return to field program, the stray hold is waived. So that's the ideal circumstances that you'd be working in, is there's no stray hold at all, and the cat can go back as soon as possible. So this statute can serve as a model if you're trying to get a similar law or similar rule in your jurisdiction. It doesn't always have to be on the state level. You might be able to do it on the municipal level. Caring for cats in traps is not very hard if you know what you're doing and you have the right equipment. You can need traps that are at least 30 inches in length and have a sliding rear door so that you can access both ends of the trap. And then you need equipment that's called trap dividers. And that's those pitchfork looking things that you see in the middle of the trap here. And this demonstrates the method. So the cat is on one end of the trap. You pull back the sheet, and feral cats especially, they tend to move from light to dark. So they'll follow the sheet towards the other end away from you. You insert the dividers, and that sections the cat off. You can then open that end of the trap that they're not on and put fresh newspaper in, which they tend to use as litter. You can put food and water in. And if you do this twice a day, the traps stay reasonably clean and they're perfectly fine. There is a video on our website, the Neighborhood Cats website. You can click on the link you see in this slide, or you can follow that pathway to get to the Caring for Cats and Traps page, and you'll find about a 5-minute video that demonstrates each step of doing this. It's a pretty simple technique, but very effective. Another thing you have to think about is tracking the cat as he moves through the shelter and to the spay neuter clinic. So this is an example of a form that created by the Maui Humane Society that they use to track the cat. Very important that there be a photo, and it's really best that it be color, because if you've got black and white photos of calico cats, for example, you could mix them up pretty easily. And so having a color photo makes misidentification less likely. And then there's all the information you can see on the form that's filled in as the cat moves through the system. And this form is attached to the trap itself. In the case of this shelter, they keep the form in a plastic sleeve that's zip tied to the front of the trap. When you get to surgery, the important thing, or I should say one of the most important things when it comes to return to field programs, is that you want to cycle the cats through your return to field program as quickly as possible. So that the less time they spend in the shelter, the healthier for the shelter, the healthier for the cat. And so your ideal situation is the cat comes in on Monday. The cat is fixed either a Monday afternoon or probably more likely Tuesday morning when the surgeries are being done, is held overnight. There's no medical issues apparent, and the cat is released on Wednesday. So comes in on Monday, is back home on Wednesday. That's your ideal cycle. Your standard veterinary treatment is going to be spay neuter, ear tip for identification, and a rabies vaccine where it's legally required. There is obviously other medical treatments that can be done if they're needed. but they tend to be as time and resources allow. So if you can, you know, clean their ears or pull a tooth or whatever it might be, that's great. It might be the only time this cat ever sees a veterinarian. But on the other hand, if you're dealing with a large volume of cats and scarce resources, as most shelters are, you know, those may not be options that are available for you, and you may need to stick to the basic, but maybe just flag the more severe cases so other shelter staff can decide what to do. Recovery time is typically overnight, so not exactly 24 hours, but 20, meaning over, you know, cat's fixed on Tuesday is released on Wednesday. Now, that has a lot to do with the experience level of your surgeon. If you have an experienced spay neuter surgeon and they're making very small incisions on the female cats, then overnight should be plenty, and certainly for the male cats. If you're dealing with a less experienced surgeon who's making a larger incision, then you may want to extend the recovery time to more like 48 hours. But most surgeons in doing this kind of work are very good at making small incisions that heal quickly. And typically, these cats do not need to be held for more than overnight. So then you get to the return, and the question becomes, the first question that you've heard me ask with like who, you know, eligibility is who does it. So you have, here are your options. You know, you can have shelter staff with a dedicated vehicle. You could have your animal control officers if they're affiliated with the shelter. You could have volunteers, or you could have a partner group. So in the beginning of the RTF program in Maui, Neighborhood Cats was the partner group, and we picked up the cats from the shelter and we brought them home. Since then, the staff at Maui Humane Society has taken that over, and they have their own, like I say, dedicated vehicle. And we're not, Susie and I are not doing that anymore. So there's the sometimes shelters find that for legal reasons, it's better to have like they may be wondering, well, is it legal for us to, you know, given the unique laws of the jurisdiction, they're not sure whether they would get into trouble if they're the group that does the actual release. So they do a transfer to a partner group, and then the partner group does the actual release because they're not beholden to the same regulations that the shelter may be. So all sorts of ways to do that. We highly recommend print out this slide and make it your standard pre-return checklist. So I'm talking about if you're the actual person who's picking up the cat from the shelter and going to be opening the door and letting the cat go, these are the things you want to do before you put the cat in your car. So we always had vet techs check the cats at the very last minute just to make sure there was nothing that, you know, nothing that wasn't going properly with the healing, or the cat had suddenly gotten URI or something like that. You want to, like a lot of shelters, even with the RTF cats, or with some of them, they may end up with collars on them or some type of identification that's typical for the shelter. And so, for example, maybe at first it was thought this cat might be an adoption candidate, so they got moved into the adoption section and got a collar put on them. And then it was determined, no, actually this isn't going to work out. And the cat got put back into the return to field process, but nobody took the collar off. Well, I can tell you from one very bad experience, you don't want to find out the cat has a collar as you're watching him run off into the distance. So that's on the checklist. Make sure that all identification has been removed. If your shelter is leaning towards not releasing friendly cats, then you want to recheck their behavior. because by the time you're ready to do a release, they may have calmed down. Verify before you go out into the field that you're returning the cat to a valid address. And what we would do, and you can see an example, this is Google Maps in this slide here, we would ring up the address on Google Maps and make sure it existed. If you see the pin go into the middle of an intersection, it means the address doesn't exist. Also, most of the time, of course, it does, but you can then use Google Maps to zoom in and actually scout the area that you'll be returning the cat to, and make decisions about where the best spot would be. And then finally, make sure the trap or the den, if you're using those, make sure it's locked and secure. When you're doing the return, there's a number of things to consider. How discreet do you want to be? Now, that, again, that's a program by program decision. There's not a right or a wrong. And it also may depend on what stage your program is at. I think when we first started, there was a lot of concern about how are people going to react to this. We tended to be much more discreet, out of sight, out of mind. But as the program has evolved, well, now a well-wrapped van pulls up and, and the cats come jumping out. So it's become much more visible and more of an opportunity to connect with the community and give information. What's the weather going to be like? Do you want to, wait until it's not raining? Do you release that in the day or at night? So if we're releasing cats into a heavily trafficked industrial area, we'll wait until dark when it's quiet. How close to the location? So, as close as you safely can. If you, again, this goes back to the information that was gathered at intake. If the notes are, hey, the finder was really angry and really hostile, well, you probably don't want to drop the cat off right in front of his front door. Maybe go to the other side of the block. The older the cat is, the more distance you can go. It's only if you're dealing with very young cats, kittens, that you need to be as close as possible to the trapping location. But an adult cat could, their territory is going to extend at least a block or two or more from the trapping location. If there was a caretaker involved, has that caretaker been contacted? Do they want to be present? If you can locate the caretaker, sometimes you can return little kittens. We've seen moms with their litters returned because there was somebody there. It was known somebody was there to take care of them. So other things to consider is the release location on public property or private. So you got to be careful about going onto private property. You don't want to be trespassing, and you may need to find the closest public location. Becomes a question of judgment when you're in this sort of quasi-public, like say a parking lot of a shopping center or of a condominium complex. Then you need your return people to use good judgment. We talked about the kittens. Now, dealing with confrontation. So it's going to be rare, but once in a while somebody's going to see you and is going to be upset about it. We recommend having material on you that lists the program's contact information and maybe a small brochure that explains what you're doing. And it's fine to try to have a conversation. If you are finding that the person is not listening to you and is just staying angry, then you need to just go. You need to hand them the flyer. If you'll take it, get in your van and go. If the cat hasn't been released yet, you think it might not be safe, then bring the cat back with you and reconsider the situation. You might keep the cat, you might let the cat go at another spot where you're not going to have that confrontation. But the one thing you don't want to do is get into an argument and a back and forth, because that just escalates things and really doesn't help anybody. It's also a good idea that for the people who are doing the returns, if they're doing them alone, somebody at the shelter should know they're out on their rounds, and be available if they do need help. Now, never had that happen. We had to make that call ourselves, and we returned, Susie and I, over 1,000 cats. But it's good to know you're not going to get put on hold if you're in an emergency. Have an emergency number. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of going quickly through the idea of how can you combine return to field and trap neuter return, not only to drive down euthanasia with return to field, but also potentially reduce the cat population in the community, so you're having to do less and less return to field over time, and it makes it more sustainable. And we often call this the red flag approach, which means in my experience, now people in the field have had different experiences, but I've done TNR in multiple communities around the country, and my experience is that these cats tend to live in groups. So if somebody brings in one cat and surrenders them to the shelter, to me that means there's probably other cats at that location. So that RTF cat becomes the red flag for there's cats at that area. So if you have 10 cats in a backyard colony and just the one cat is surrendered, because again, remember, this kind of trapping tends to be very inefficient. The person may only have one trap. The other, they may not know how to do this in a way that is effective for all the cats, may only do it once, whatever it might be. That cat is brought, he's returned to field. And now you've got 1 out of 10 cats who's been spayed or neutered, as indicated by the red circle, and 9 cats who are not. Okay, so that's not going to make any difference in the long term over the number of cats, because the loss of reproductive capacity in that one cat is more than compensated for by the 9 cats who can still reproduce. So the limit on the number of cats is just going to be the carrying capacity. How much food is available. If you look at return to field alone from a community viewpoint, and you're just doing RTFs of individual cats, this is what it may look like, right? You may get a couple from one group here and one from a group there, but none of these colonies of cats or groups or neighborhoods or however unit you want to use, the sterilization levels are not going to be high enough for the number of cats to go down over time. You have to have a high sterilization rate in order for attrition and removal of cats for adoption or things like that, for that to outpace new cats being born. You need to have a high sterilization rate. And with return to field, that's not the purpose of the program. So that's generally not achieved. So there's basically, it's neutral when it comes to population control. But what if we used this cat as a red flag, and then we went into that neighborhood and TNR'd all the rest of the other 9 cats? Now we have 10 out of 10 who are sterilized, and our opportunity for the numbers to go down over time has greatly increased. And if you look at it from a community point of view, this is what it looks like. So our red are the RTF cats, and then the blue are the follow-up TNR cats. It's what we call, the first one we call colony level targeting, and this is also an example of colony level targeting, where we're trying to get high sterilization rates within all the RTF cats groups. Now you can do it another way, which is what we call community level targeting, where you don't use the RTF cat as a red flag unless they're in your target area. So in this case, zip code 3 is where we have the most cats in the community and the most complaints and the most intake. So we're going to go in and we're going to TNR any cats we can in zip code 3. We're going to put our resources there, use the RTF cats as red flags, but also look for other cats in zip code 3. And in the other zip codes, we're just going to do RTF. We're not going to worry about population control there because it's not as important as population control in zip code 3. which is the most problematic. So that's another way to combine targeting with return to field. This combination of targeting and return to field was part of what was called the Community Cat Program that was led by Best Friends Animal Society in these 6 cities. And you can see it was very successful, that feline euthanasia went down on average by 83%, but at the same time, intake went down by 32%. So not only were they getting more cats out alive, they were having fewer cats coming in. So the combination of those 2 methods is very powerful. And this is a close-up look at one of those cities, Albuquerque, and it just tells the chart tells the tales. So again, we're interested in both euthanasia and intake, and the green is the number of return to field cats, and didn't have that number for 2015 and 16. But basically 2010 was before anything happened. I believe it was, no, I'm sorry. I want to get my years correct. I believe 2010 was the base year. So they a little less than 10,000 cats coming in, and a little over half of them were being euthanized. Then in 2011, the shelter on its own started a return to field program. And you can see how from 2010 to 2011, you see the green. So those were the number of cats returned to field. And so once again, we see euthanasia go down by a corresponding amount. But look at intake compared to 2011 to 2010. It actually went up a little bit. So the return to field program had a dramatic impact on euthanasia and none on intake. Then in 2012, the return to field program was complemented by a targeted TNR program. So you see euthanasia continuing to drop as the return to field continued, but now because there's population control happening with the targeting, intake starts to go down, and it keeps going down throughout the ensuing years. So as euthanasia is dropping, so is intake. So that's your ideal program, which is you want to work yourself out of a job. You want to get return to field numbers down to a minimum, and the way to do that is to cut off the flow of cats coming in. If you're interested in targeting and learning more about it, there's a free webinar that the recording is available on the Community Cats Podcast website, and it goes over targeting and how to do it in great detail. If you're not certified and you're interested in our TNR certification workshop, where we just go over all the nuts and bolts of TNR on a ground level, our next workshop will be October 5th, and you can click this link to register. So we have time for some questions, Kristen, if you'd like.
Always love questions, Brian. We get to pick your brain. It's great. I did also want to mention too that colony caretaking tips and tricks is the next free webinar we have up, and I am popping that into the chat. If you guys enjoyed this, you will also enjoy that. And I saw a few questions in here that had to do with taking care of a colony, so I thought that might be helpful. Okay, so somebody in the chat had mentioned that they knew there was abuse or killing of cats going on at one particular house on a block. They're trying to TNR. They had the police come out. They didn't find evidence, so now they have baby kittens there. How do you handle it when, in the rare case when there is actually abuse, somebody follows through on that? I hate the cats and I want them gone.
Yeah, well, that's when you have to seek alternate placements,
Mm-hmm.
and you may have that really tough decision about, is euthanasia kinder than putting a cat back in a situation that they're going to be abused.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully that's where it takes that extra yard to get a live outcome, to find a relocation or to find a sanctuary or to bring in partners from even other parts of the country to place kittens and cats and things like that. But yeah, I would not be comfortable putting a cat back into a known cruelty situation.
Mm-hmm. Barn cat programs, if you're not familiar, out there,
Working
fine.
cat programs too are
Yeah.
becoming more and more popular, where breweries and businesses that typically have rodent problems are basically adopting
Mhm.
cats to keep on the premises. So that's another program that is actually gaining in popularity.
Yes, I have a whole collection of stickers from breweries that have cats. They especially it's a managed relocation, so I feel like that's a little bit easier than trying to relocate a whole colony. Talk a little bit about relocating. So you've got a situation where you can't put the cats back. Um, there is always a question, why can't we just release them in the field next to the school or whatever? Like they think that it's a good place for cats to be. Why is that not a great idea? And when you do relocate, do you recommend a particular process or do you not recommend it at all? What's your
Well,
preference?
there are types of wildlife that are called cold release animals, and they're
Mhm.
animals that you can take from one environment and place in a similar environment somewhere else, and they'll be perfectly fine. That's not cats.
No.
Cats are very, very tied to their territory and to their food source. And if you release them somewhere else without a proper relocation uh, process, they're going to immediately run away and try to find their old haunting grounds. So
Mhm.
what you have to do is you have to confine them in the new territory for ideally 2 to 3 weeks, and teach them that their food source has changed.
Mhm.
So um, on Maui, after the fire, destroyed, all of the town of Lahaina, we had to one of the, we had like hundreds of community cats on our hands, and one of the ways that we relocated them is we bought um, uh, large outdoor enclosures for
Mhm.
people to get on Petco and stuff like that. So they have little huts they can hang out in, and a 6 foot outdoor area and a door you can. And we set those up for people. Now, Humane Society set those up for people, and then they would keep the cats in there for 3 weeks, and then open the door and let them out. And by then, they were acclimated to their new neighborhood. So you have to go through that type of process.
Mhm.
There's a chapter in the TNR handbook that's one of the handouts today that describes the relocation process in detail.
Excellent, excellent. All right, we are at time. Brian, do you want to take one more question, or are you guys
Oh, sure. Yeah.
okay? Excellent. I have one good one here. Um, what do you do if you're returning cats and they don't have a feeder, or there's not a colony manager hanging around keeping an eye on them? Like, are there concerns that you have? How do you mitigate those concerns? Do you assign a caretaker? What is your process for doing that?
Um, so it's one of the things I mentioned in the very beginning, which is usually with a return to field cat, you do not, you have not identified the caretaker, and you don't know who the feeder is, and you don't know who the caretaker is. And the reason you're putting the cat back without knowing that is if the cat came in good condition, then it's you can assume that somebody is taking care of the cat, right? It might be a bunch of neighbors, it might be an individual caretaker. So identifying who the actual feeder is usually not part of the return to field process. The only time you would really want to do that is if you had special cases like maybe a disabled cat or very young kittens, where you wouldn't be comfortable just leaving them, and so you can't make the assumption that they'd be okay. But when a cat comes in good body weight and healthy, um, it's somebody is taking care of that cat, even if you don't know who.
Yeah, yeah. They were doing fine before you got there. They will do
And they'll
fine
be fine
afterwards.
after. Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, it is 4 o'clock, so I'm going to end this. If you had a question that has not been answered yet, We do send all of these questions to Susie, who types away, and she must have the strongest fingers in the entire world because she answers every single one of them. So don't fret if you haven't got your question answered. You'll be seeing an answer in the next couple of weeks via email. And we really appreciate that you guys are here. Join us again for either a TNR workshop or that colony caretaking tips and tricks, or any of the new ones next year. We're going to be announcing those dates shortly. So thank you again to Brian and Susie for all of your expertise and sharing this presentation. And we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks at the TNR workshop.